Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the studios of 91.7 KALW in San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that began at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus.
And they migrate from there to the air, and from the air to the internet via our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org. And you can also download podcast of our program as well. John, our topic today is whether science can explain consciousness, and we're going to tackle this topic in three parts. First, we're going to delve into the mystery of consciousness. It's a very puzzling phenomenon. Secondly, there are some philosophical arguments that there's an unbridgeable explanatory gap between science, what science can explain, and this phenomenon of consciousness. And third, we're going to ask, well, if there is an explanatory gap, what's the significance? Does that mean that religion was right? There's more to the mind than there could be than there is in the brain? Or maybe the mind is just a mysterious hunk of meat? It is just a brain, and we'll never understand it.
Well, let me take my mysterious hunk of meat and get started here. First, let's ask, what do we mean by consciousness? And I think what we mean is just that we have experiences. It's like something to be us, to think, to feel, to taste, to see. And that seems to be a basic difference between us and other things, tables and chairs, even between us and intelligent computers. They can do things, they have intelligence, but we don't really believe they have experiences, do we?
Well, I grant you that. Maybe computers don't have experience, and certainly tables and chairs don't, but I don't quite understand where the mystery is yet. I mean, as we know more and more about the brain, won't consciousness be better and better understood, just like everything else?
Yeah, but won't there always be a gap? Let me give you an example, Ken. I think you're old enough to remember the classic movie Fantastic Voyage. Arthur Kennedy and Raquel Welch are put in a submarine, which is then shrunk down to a very small size so it can be inserted into the bloodstream of a dissident Russian scientist who's had a stroke. Remember that?
Yeah, I remember that movie. The idea was that this little laser, you could destroy the blood clot because the laser was so small you wouldn't destroy any of his important memories, right?
That's right. All right, so now imagine that I'm with Arthur Kennedy and Raquel Welch in the submarine floating around in this guy's brain. Matter of fact, let's assume we're floating around in your brain. We can see everything that happens in your brain. We are as in good a position as a scientist would be with the most powerful microscope. Now I ask you, could we see a thought? Could we see a sensation? Could we tell what you were thinking? Would we know what it was like for you to be tasting Pinot Noir just because we see what's happening in your brain?
Well, if we were just plunged down there without any neuroscientific knowledge or background, we'd be puzzled. But if we had done a lot of neuroscience before, neuroscience could say, yeah, see, there are the correlates of consciousness. There's the C fiber firing, and so there's pain. Yeah, we could do it.
Yeah, but there'd still be a gap. Maybe that little pattern of activity in the brain is correlated with the taste of Pinot Noir. But isn't the taste of Pinot Noir something different? Why does that brain activity give rise to this particular sensation? That's what philosophers call the explanatory gap, the gap between anything we could know about the brain and what it's like to have the conscious experience that's connected with it.
Okay, you've got me a little puzzled, maybe deeply puzzled, and we're going to dig into that. And to help us start digging into that, our roving philosophical reporter, Zoe Corneli, went out and she files this report.
Imagine sitting in a theater. Everything is dark, except a spotlight shining on an actor playing Hamlet on the stage.
To be or not to be? That is the question.
The only thing you're thinking about is what's happening in that spotlight. But there's a lot more going on in the theater. There are other people in the audience, and behind the scenes, directors, stage managers, and costume designers have all helped create what you're seeing right now.
To sleep no more.
That's the analogy cognitive psychologist Bernard Bars uses to describe consciousness.
Tons of little processors running around, doing all kinds of interesting and important things, such as analyzing the language that you're hearing right now. You're doing that unconsciously. And the same thing for the speaking control system, and the same thing for vision, and so on. So all the conscious things that you're aware of are kind of embedded in this huge swarm of unconscious processors, which are very sophisticated and which operate without conscious intervention.
Those are the directors and stage managers. Your conscious experience is what's in the spotlight.
And the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to.
Barr's research started out with a simple question about consciousness.
When do we have more of it? and when do we have less of it? And the most obvious example of that, of course, is falling asleep.
To sleep, a chance to dream.
Since the 1980s, Dr. Bars has found many more examples of unconscious states. He compares them to conscious states to try to isolate exactly what it means to be conscious.
And you start seeing what happens when people lose consciousness, which happens, for example, with a condition that's called epileptic absence, where people have a momentary epileptic seizure, but not enough to make them fall down or anything like that. They just freeze. I once saw a speaker at a conference go through this, and he just stopped. And so we can ask the question, well, what has he lost during that moment of epileptic absence?
Another example is called inattentional blindness.
You may have seen this demonstration in your psychology class. If you're looking at a little movie of students tossing a basketball back and forth, and your task is to count the times the basketball is passed between the students with the white shirts and the students with the black shirts. And somebody walks on the stage in a gorilla costume and waves at you. You may not see that at all.
The light is hitting your retina. Your visual cortex identifies a person in a gorilla suit. But if that information isn't broadcast to the rest of your brain, you won't know it's there. You're not conscious of it.
You need to have involvement of the non-sensory cortex or the non-visual cortex for visual consciousness to be experienced. Because one hypothesis is that consciousness is the national media of the brain. It's the broadcasting system. It's the radio and TV, or the World Wide Web.
So, if all the world's a stage, perhaps the most important one is in your mind.
Aye, there's the rubber.
For Philosophy Talk, I'm Zoe Corneely.
I'm John Perry. With me is Ken Taylor.
And we're joined today by Joseph Levine. He's professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's author of Purple Haze, The Puzzle of Consciousness. Joe, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Thanks for having me here. It's good to be here.
Joe, suppose we had a very intelligent robot who helped us around the house. Suppose this robot was very sophisticated. It's got computer vision. It really moves around the house as well or better than I do. How could we tell if it were just a very useful machine or if it really was a being with visual sensations and some of the rest of consciousness?
Well, that's just the point. I'm not sure how we could tell. I noticed you earlier on talked about the Fantastic Voyage. I actually remember a great scene in the second Terminator movie, which I assume everyone knows about. But when Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's the hero in this one, gets riddled with bullets, the young boy he's protecting, John, asks him as he sees him take out all these bullets, he says, "Does it hurt?" And he says, "Oh, I detect the damage. I suppose you could call the data pain." And what's interesting about that is that's not answering John's question. He wants to know if it hurts. He doesn't want to know, do you have a system for detecting damage and avoiding future damage and helping yourself and trying to overcome it? No, we want to know from, as it were, the first person. Does it hurt? And what's interesting is nothing Schwarzenegger could tell him really will constitute a definitive answer.
Wait a minute. I'm going to be a dunce here for a second. I'm trying to understand this distinction you're making between I have a system for detecting the damage, and it's mine, and it plays a role, I suppose, in controlling my behavior, right? Because I have the system.
Yeah.
When it detects damage, I behave in certain ways, and the system is connected to my avoidance behavior. And then you ask this other question, does it hurt? What's the difference between having a system that detects damage and plays a role in my behavior and it hurting? I mean, why isn't the one just the other?
Well, I think you know the difference, actually. So you're not as much of a dunce as you say that you are. Look, I mean, this is part of what's so difficult about articulating the puzzle is, and this come up actually in the Bernard Bars thing you just had on, is that if we're going to operationalize what it is that consciousness does in the system, then already we've taken a kind of third-person perspective, and already we've kind of answered the question in a certain way. And then it's
let me just interrupt. There's a couple of terms there. Operationalize. In other words, what Ken did was say, I'm going to look at the causes and effects of the pain.
Right.
And third person, you're saying, well, that's opposed to first person. That when we talk about consciousness, we talk about the first person, what I'm feeling. And Ken's kind of looking at himself from the third person and saying,
that's right.
I can, yeah. So just wanted to clarify that. Go ahead.
Right. I mean, the idea is if I take as the sort of basic data evidence that a theory of the mind needs to explain is how you behave a certain way, how your behavior is organized and the like, then I agree. I think neuroscience and cognitive psychology and whatever combination, they're going to explain all that. The question is, we seem to have a conception. We seem to understand what it is to experience from from inside. And it doesn't seem to necessarily be the same thing, because at least we can imagine a computer. We do all the time, as the sort of, things you were talking about earlier. We can imagine a computer that doesn't have this inside perspective and yet can detect its own damage, can actually initiate procedures for rectifying it. I mean, that doesn't seem hard to conceive of at all.
But now, aren't there really two questions that our beloved governor in Terminator 2 didn't fully answer? I mean, one question is, look, Arnold, or Terminator 2, or whoever you are, when you're removing those bullets or whatever you're doing, is it like something? Are you conscious, or are you just an automaton? And the second question is what it's like when you remove the bullets, what it's like when we feel pain. Can't you imagine that the answer to the first question is yes, but the answer to the second question is no?
Those are good questions for our audience. We'd like you to weigh in on these questions. Joe, I think you're kind of saying, and John, consciousness is this subjectivity thing, this first person, intrinsically subjective, and it can't be understood from any other perspective. What do you think, callers? Is there this irreducible first-person thing? Give us a call, 1-800-525-9917.
And if the governor's listening, he can just call and tell us what he actually felt.
So, Joe, what do you think about John's distinction between these two kind of questions that Arnold's confusing?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if he's confusing them. Look, I do think they're both there, and I do think, in fact, they both, in their own ways, contribute to what we might generally call the puzzle of consciousness. In fact, you can sort of see it in the standard phrase that Thomas Nagel made famous in an early article, what it's like for me to have a certain kind of experience, this what it's like for me. There's the issue of there being anything it's like for me, and that's what separates conscious things from non-conscious things. And then there's the particular question, the what it's like. And we can, of course, imagine creatures that have and it's like for them. There's something it's like for them, but what it's like, it would be very difficult for us to figure out.
Well, after a break, Joe, I'm going to ask you to tell me more about this what it's like question. I'm not quite sure I fully got it. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. This time, Can Science Explain Consciousness? Our guest is Joseph Levine from the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Join the conversation. Do you think consciousness is just a brain activity? What would you ask your household robot to determine whether it was conscious and you ought to be kind to it? You can join us by calling toll-free at 1-800-525-9917. That's 1-800-525-9917.
And we'll make a conscious effort to take your calls and emails when Philosophy Talk continues.
This is Philosophy Talk. I'm John Perry. Our topic today, Science and Consciousness. Our guest, Joseph Levine, author of Purple Haze, The Puzzle of Consciousness. Tell us your thoughts.
As a matter of fact, don't just tell us your thoughts. Tell us what it's like to have your thoughts, to be conscious. How do we determine where consciousness begins and ends? Is your cat, for example, conscious? Or your laptop?
The toll-free number is 1-800-525-9917. That's 1-800-525-9917. You can also email us at comments@philosophytalk.org.
Joe, I want to ask you about this thing you were talking about, the the what it's like question, but I also want to combine that with a worry about science. I take it that it's because of the first personal nature of this what is like question, right? It's only something we can answer from the first person, and the fact that science is from the third person, right? That science gives us third-personish descriptions and explanations of the world. Is that what worries you about this explanatory gap? Is that where it arises?
Well, that would be more like a diagnosis of where it arises, and yes, I think that's a perfectly appropriate speculation. But I don't want to pin it on, and I don't want to say there's some absolute in principle bar of ever using, as it were, third-person accessible or third-person perspective descriptions to ever explain something. What I notice, it seems to me, is that what we are in fact doing when we find the so-called neurological correlates of conscious states or give certain kinds of computational information processing accounts of mental processes is what I start with is just noticing they don't actually explain. They don't. Let me give just another example. We know a lot about color vision. We know a lot about the processing of it. We know a lot about the neurology of it. And yet, it still seems kind of arbitrary that a certain neurological state should be what it's like to see red and another one what it's like to see green. Yet we know there's this intrinsic difference between these things. One's reddish and one's greenish.
But yeah. Look, Joseph, let me give you an analogy. When we talk about a gap, that means something's missing. Right. If we've got a chain that's supposed to hold our boat to the dock and there's a link missing, the boat will float away. But once we get the chain completed, there's no gap just because there's nothing left to do. Now, suppose I've got a book, called All of Science, or everything anybody could want to know about the brain. When we talk about third person, we're talking about the way books are written, at least scientific books. So I'm sitting there reading it, and I'm reading about what happens when you see things, how come some things are red because of the light they reflect, what happens in my eyes when I see red, what happens in the rods and cones, what happens in the optic nerve, what happens in the brain. Mm-hmm. Now, isn't the point of all that to build a chain from science to my experience? Isn't that really what all knowledge is about? So when I get to this last step and I say, oh, that's what's going on in my brain, when this happens, the chain is complete. There's nothing left to explain, so there's no gap. What's wrong with that picture?
Well, the chain all the way up to the last stage where it's what happens in my brain, I agree. I mean, we actually have gaps now, but those are the kind of gaps that we expect a completed science is going to fill in. But then there's that last point. This is firing, and, well, what? I know it happens at the same time I'm having the red experience, so obviously it's not arbitrary. But if you had just told me this thing was firing and you had given me all the science, it's not clear at all. I could tell, well, that was going to be a reddish sensation or that was going to be a greenish one. And I do think to explain something means to show it to have been expected or predictable. Well, from the information we use to explain it.
Surely that's in general true. But if all knowledge is kind of really telling us what it's like to be in various situations, then we would expect that there's something very special about the last step in which we just say, and that's what it's like to be in the brain state you're in.
Well, look, you could take the following, and this gets on to some of the stuff you were talking about. It's going to come later in the show, but I mean, you could take the position that, look, this is a kind of brute fact. This is one of these brute facts that you have in nature, like, say what the gravitational constant is or something like that. They're just these facts, and there is something it's like to be in this kind of state. There isn't in that one, and that's just a brute fact about the world. But that would be very puzzling indeed.
That would be puzzling. Let's see what puzzles our callers about consciousness. Mark in Redwood City's on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Mark.
Good morning. I have a quick comment and then a question. My comment is I think it's very, very difficult to answer these questions when we are, in effect, incapable of objectivity in questioning our process of questioning. My question is, at what level do we define consciousness and how do we define it? I mean, we would all agree, I think, that a dog has consciousness. We would probably agree that a bird does. But does a lizard have consciousness? Does a beetle? Does a starfish? Does an amoeba? And at what point in the evolutionary ladder of neural activity does a brain or something capable of consciousness develop?
Well, Mark, let me just, before we plunge into the last part of your question, let's go back to the first part. What do you mean by objectivity and that we don't have objectivity or can't have objectivity?
Well, it's sort of a way of saying, I get these names confused sometimes. Is it the Heisenberg principle that says you can't measure the speed and location of an object at the same time? How can we ask objective questions about something when we are in effect the subject? I mean, it's our own consciousness.
Well, Mark, that's true. But you said, thanks for the call, Mark. But Mark, you said that we're all kind of confident that the dog has consciousness. I want to ask John and Joe whether they agree with that, because we're puzzling about this first-person, third-person thing. Well, if we can be confident that the dog has consciousness, we can only be confident from the outside, as it were, on the basis of its behavior and what it does. So maybe, consciousness manifests itself in third-person observable thing. I'm confident, Joe, that you have consciousness. I'm confident that John has consciousness. So what's the big mystery if we're confident that there's consciousness there just from observing people from a third-person point of view?
Well, and Ken, I want to tell you, I am confident about you having it too.
Thanks, Joe.
But, look, I'd be a little less confident. I mean, I have evidence, okay? And the evidence is, it's tricky to articulate. But one thing that would start to make me wonder is if somebody said, hey, watch this about Ken, and opened your head, and then I found a lot of electronic processes in there. Now, I'm not saying that would show you don't have consciousness, but I think a doubt would creep in. I'd wonder. And so the fact that I know I am a certain way, and I have no doubts that something about the way I'm built, about my physical embodiment, is responsible, I'm just saying I'm not sure how, I don't see what the explanation is, and the fact that you are quite like me has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I see your point. I'm not completely convinced, but I want to let some more of our callers in here. 1-800-525-9917. We're talking about the mystery of consciousness and whether science can explain consciousness. And Kevin in San Francisco is on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Kevin.
Hi, thanks for the great show, as usual. I think we want to be really careful when we're talking about human consciousness to remember that we are social beings. If we talk about ourselves as if we're these isolated units, we lose the fact that consciousness is a relational phenomenon, and the proof is in the few cases of feral children, F-E-R-A-L, that were raised by wolves or whatever. They're not truly human. They don't have culture. They don't have language. They can't communicate. So I think in all of the things we say about consciousness, we have to remember that consciousness is a product of social interaction and social networking.
Kevin, I think that's a very good point, and I want to try out a distinction that I think is relevant to what Kevin said and also what our last caller said, and that's between what I would call having sensations and being conscious in a somewhat different sense. It's characteristic of humans that we not only have sensations and experiences, it's like something to see an apple or to taste some peanut brittle. But we also think about them. We have concepts and words, and we plan to have various experiences and not have other experiences. Now, that seems to me a likely major dividing line between us and much of the rest of the animal kingdom. I have no doubt that dogs have sensations and in that sense are consciousness. But I doubt very much if they think about their sensations and have names for them. And that, I think Kevin makes the point, and that's unlikely to happen without a social context.
Well, I agree with you. And John, I think this is a deep and important point, and I wonder about something. In the Roving Philosophical Reporter piece a while back, Bernard Baer said something about consciousness is the national broadcast system of the mind, right? It makes all this stuff available to all this other stuff. I think he's maybe running together two different things. A philosopher named Ned Block has this distinction between phenomenal consciousness, as what it's like to experience red or to feel pain, and then what he calls access consciousness. That's what it's like to have all this stuff available for, as he puts it, rational control. And that's kind of what you're talking about and what Kevin was talking about, because there's this kind of theater that unifies all this stuff. But here's my question for you, Joe. Right. Could we really have phenomenal consciousness of what it's like unless there was a subject, a unified subject, to whom it was like something? I mean, are these really separate things or not?
No, I don't think they are. In fact, I've had disagreements with Ned Block about this. I think there is an irreducible element of access built into the very notion of phenomenal consciousness. And it comes out in the very phrase, what it's like for me. I don't think you can talk about there being an it's like if there's not a me there for it to be. Well, you know how that goes. But unified subject, this is already getting more complex. Right. I mean, whether we have to talk about being unified across all of one's mental capacities or unified across time, these questions, I think, might be separable from the question, in any moment of consciousness, must there be a subject for whom this is an experience?
But doesn't this make the whole explanatory gap problem much more complicated than people think? Because if you're right, that there's no kind of what it's like unless there's a subject to whom it's like something, right? And if being a subject is a complicated state, a complicated organizational state of your brain, of course you can't go state by state and look at the neurophysiological correlates of that state and then say, aha, that's why it's like this. Because, that's just a state in a whole complicated system of states. And until you've got that whole complicated system, right? I mean, isn't that why this explanatory gap seems to arise? Because we're looking too local?
Well, you might say that. And, I don't want to put everything on the subject. So notice that once you got me into having a visual system and having that integrated into a general thinking system and all of that, there still is this question about, okay, so why is it reddish rather than greenish? And that's a nice one, because there really are reasons for thinking that with slight modifications to the way our visual system worked, it would be possible for those to be formally almost exactly the same. And I don't know that all this other stuff about the subject is going to help you decide that question.
Victor in Berkeley's on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Victor.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to offer a scenario, and that is that suppose you had a screen in front of you on which you could see your neurons firing, and to a very exact degree, the specific neurons that have to do with your thought. And suppose, given that you eat an apple, well, I would say that the taste of the apple is not the same thing as seeing neurons firing, and that consequently one is not reducible to the other, and consequently what you have is actually a correlation between a screen and a taste, and one doesn't reduce to the other, and consequently you don't have explanation in that.
Victor, you've got great philosophical cousins in this thought experiment. You can go back to Leibniz, who said supposedly made the brain large and walked around it. We could never see a thought. But the particular thing you have in mind was introduced by Herbert Feigl, and he called it an autocerebroscope. So suppose you're sitting there and you're looking at your own brain through some kind of artificially or some kind of a technically adroit tool. Now, I agree that seeing the neurons is not the same as tasting the apple. But you wouldn't have to say that seeing the neurons was the same as tasting the apple. You'd have to say that what you're seeing is the tasting of the apple. And why should it look like it feels like?
Right.
But, it's
excellent. Joe, what do you think?
No, well, I agree. So, I mean, I don't think that the fact that the seeing of the neurons is not the same thing as the tasting. I mean, I agree with precisely what John just said. So the question isn't that the tasting and the seeing of the neurons should actually amount to the same thing. That would be those are the wrong elements to try to identify. What I think should matter, and seeing isn't enough, is that understanding what's going on with the neuron should yield an understanding of why it tastes the way it tastes. And I don't think that necessarily is the same thing as being in the state of tasting it. So where I see the explanatory gap coming in is in the gap between an understanding of the neural process and then an understanding of why it's like what it's like.
I'm not yet sure I understand, at least from what you said today, why you think there is such a gap. Why is it so Why are you so sure that there's an explanatory gap? I mean, why can't neuroscience just accrete more and more and more information about the organization and functioning of our brain, and then presto, change outcomes and explanation of consciousness? What's the big deal?
Well, look, yeah, I mean, one kind of question is, well, we can learn more. But now the question is, well, what kind of stuff are we going to learn more? And I think it's precisely what you said. It's going to be the organization, the patterns of firing, the finding out which groups of neurons are in fact feeding into and inhibiting other groups of neurons. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we can get more information about. Now the question is, what does that tell us? It seems to me the only thing it can really tell us is how information from the environment and internally is preserved or transformed in some way. That is, that the stuff about the neurons is going to explain how that's implemented, just like an electronic engineer is going to tell you how the software in your computer is implemented in that machine. So first we have to understand how an experience can be captured in terms of the transformation and preservation of information. That's the real step.
Yeah.
Then the neurons will come in to explain the implementation.
Okay, so we'll take this up more. We'll explore the significance of this gap, assuming there is this gap. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. The topic, Can Science Explain Consciousness? Joining us is Joseph Levine from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst.
In the next segment, we'll consider whether consciousness poses a problem for physicalism. Physicalism is the idea that the world is no more than physical things with physical properties, including our brains, and that that's all we are.
And we'll get to more of your calls and emails when Philosophy Talk continues.
Today's program is brought to you by Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
Kant's critique is 99 and 44/100% pure. You can't do better than that.
Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, accept no substitutes.
Do you, Mr. Jones?
I'm John Perry. We're digging into the question of whether science can ever explain consciousness, because this is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor, and we're talking with Joe Levine about the nature of consciousness. John, I see we've got a whole stack of emails there. You want to pick out your favorite from that whole
Yes,
stack?
we've got a stack of emails, some long, some short. I'll start with a short one that maybe will lead us into the topic of this part of the program. This is Eric from Battleground, Washington, and he says, if doubts about a person's consciousness might creep in when opening their head and finding gears and wheels, what observable behaviors in a person would produce similar doubts? Could the answer give us insights in what we intuitively believe it is to be conscious? So what in the behavior of a person would make you suspect they had gears or something less conscious than we do going on in their heads?
That's for you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks. Well, look, I mean, in a certain way, I think the issue with behavior is the absence of behavior that we normally take to be, strongly indicative, if not decisively indicative, of the presence of consciousness. So, I mean, obviously, if people don't react to things the way you expect them to, or they don't react, in particular, in a complex and subtle manner, it is. Look, I think it is really hard, and this you get from the Schwarzenegger example, and you get it from the data example, and even from opening Ken and finding gears and wheels. It is incredibly difficult for us to interact with a creature that can talk and express what look like emotions and all of that, and not attribute those states to them.
What's the data example, Joe?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Data from Star Trek 2.
Oh, okay.
Who is a robot?
An android.
Is an android and completely electronic.
Look, I'm a little worried about this way of thinking, but this is a very philosophical way that we could imagine that there's these creatures who behave like us, talk like us, say all the right things, and then we open them up and we're startled by what we find. Of course, let's look at there's two things. First of all, I'm convinced that you're conscious because of the way you behave and the things you say and all that, right? I open your head and I find this oatmeal, this gray oatmeal in there, right? And I say, oh, how does that oatmeal stuff embody this consciousness? It's not going to convince me that there isn't consciousness. So if I had saw a robot that was walking, talking, behaving, speaking, acting like it was conscious, and I opened up and I found gears and pulleys, why shouldn't I say, how do these gears and pulleys realize consciousness? What's the difference between finding this gray oatmeal in your head when I'm antecedently convinced that you're conscious and finding these gears and pulleys or silicon chips? I mean, it's just different ways of realizing the same thing.
Well, it seems to me that's the right answer if we really understood what Bernard Baars is trying to explain to us, and maybe has at least part of the right answer about what is the function of consciousness. If we really knew what that oatmeal was doing for us, then if we found gears and pulleys doing that for someone else, then we say we're definitely conscious. It would still be a question to which I would think the answer was probably no, whether their consciousness, what it's like to be them, is the same as what it's like to be us. What do you think, Joe?
But this talk about the function, I think still, you've got this. A function is you can think of it as something like a role to be played, right? So, and I think very much in that piece from Bernard Baars, you got that idea, the role of the spotlight, or something of that sort. And for instance, there's a lot of research now on attention, or there has been in psychology for years on attention, and I think really that's what he's talking about is attention, which I don't think it's the same thing necessarily as consciousness. But yeah, when you identify a role, then of course it gives you a definite question about, okay, let's figure out how that role is implemented. Let's figure out what does that role. And but I think that if you think of consciousness as the role, you're missing the point. I think consciousness maybe in us is what plays the role. Then we find a mechanism that plays the role, and then we find ourselves in this puzzling situation. Wait, how is the consciousness the same thing as the mechanism? And we actually have a kind of almost a sort of conceptual confusion about it. But the main thing I want to resist is the identifying the consciousness with the role itself.
So Joe, you've written a book, Purple Haze, in which you talk a lot about the explanatory gap. You believe there is an explanatory gap, and it's likely, although maybe not certain, to remain so. What's as we say in philosophy, what's the metaphysical upshot of this? Are you convinced that there's a soul, that there's an immaterial substance involved in there that would close the gap? What do you think?
Well, no, I think there isn't, and in fact, even many other people who think there is some kind of dualism of the physical and the mental don't have to necessarily think there's a soul. But I go even further, actually, in the direction of materialism than many of my fellow consciousness warriors. I think there's a kind of puzzle here that's very deep, and I compare it. You talked about Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason a moment ago. I think it's something like what Kant called an antinomy, which means where you have what look like a contradictory conclusion where you have perfectly good reasons to go for each side of the contradiction. I think we have actually excellent reasons for thinking that the physical is really all there is. Yet there's this explanatory gap, and we can't figure out how that could be.
Let's see. Wait a minute. Let me see what this adds up to. So you think, and I want to know why this gap persists. If you're right, because you're willing to be a materialist, the mind is nothing in some sense, nothing but a hunk of meat. It's not some dualistic immaterial substance. It's just a hunk of meat, right? And it works like hunk of meat do. But then you say, but then science can't explain this feature of it, consciousness.
Right?
Why not? Is that because science is just inept? Right? I mean, if it were dualism, if the mind was one thing and the brain was something entirely separate, and they were maybe joined at the pineal gland or something, but they weren't really the same thing, then you could see why there could be a gap. But if the mind is just the brain, that's what the materialist says, the mind is just the brain, why can't science explain it, if it can explain the brain?
Look, I'm only trying to show that it hasn't explained it, and that the tools that we happen to have at the moment in both neuroscience and in cognitive psychology don't seem apt for explaining it. I think the question of why we're in this position of an explanatory gap is as big a puzzle in a certain way as, in fact, maybe it's not even distinguishable from the explanatory gap itself. It clearly has something to do with the fact that as subjects of experience, we have a different take on our experience than we have when we indulge in scientific explanation. And understanding the nature of what a first-person perspective is would go, I think, a long way toward answering your question. But I still think it's possible to be in the situation of thinking, look, the mind must be the brain. Good reasons for that. But I don't quite see that all the physical stuff explains all the mental stuff. There's no contradiction in that, but it yields a puzzle.
Okay, that's a fair way to look at it. I mean, in kind of an uncharacteristically Kantian frame of mind, I might say, isn't part of the problem here that we're trying to get the conditions for knowledge into the subject matter of knowledge? I mean, knowledge means, I think, ultimately understanding what it's like for things to be true. If you try to take that what it's like and put it over on the other side of the equation, so to speak, then you'll be involved in one of these antinomies. That's my uncharacteristically Kantian take on this whole thing.
We got this thing. So consciousness is a sort of self-presentation, right? Self-awareness. And we think we know ourselves deeply through consciousness. We know some really important facts about who we are and what we are through consciousness. But we got this science, which is another way of gathering understanding. Right. And it's like never the twain, science and conscious, and this sort of conscious self-awareness are never going to meet up or something like that. Or at least we don't see how to make them meet up.
Right. We don't see how. Right.
Yeah.
That's what
And is that because we're too dumb? I mean, is it a limit of our brain? Is it in the I'm trying to figure out, is it in the nature of the thing, or is it in the limits of our mind? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a position on that. I certainly don't think we're it's not a matter of being dumb. I mean, Colin McGinn is a philosopher who has said maybe we just don't have the concepts. The way, dogs don't have concepts that allow them to talk about science. We just fail to have the concepts of the appropriate linking properties between the mind and the brain. That's, of course, a possibility, but it strikes me that it's too cheap. It's too cheap a move. It's too easy, and then you say, well, then there's just no point trying to think about it anymore. I think maybe we can make conceptual progress here if we could get as clear as one could be, which I don't feel I've done yet in my work, about really where the source of the problem is.
Joseph, I can't help but ask, what's going to be the title of your next book? You had such a great title for Purple Haze.
Oh, well, how about Hey Joe?
Hey, Joe. But I do think you've left us with a really interesting thought. Joe, it seems we're awaiting a Copernican revolution, as it were, in the study of mind and consciousness. And we haven't pulled off that revolution yet, but that's kind of what you think it's going to take, a kind of revolution in the way we think about things.
Right.
Well, on that note, I'm going to thank you for joining us. It's been a really great conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Our guest has been Joseph Levine, professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, author of Purple Haze, The Puzzle of Consciousness.
We want to also thank the callers we didn't get a chance to talk to, and we had a pile of interesting emails, some of them sort of technical for our purposes, but at any rate, very intelligent and thoughtful, and thanks a lot for listening and helping us think about these things.
So, John, what did you learn today? I mean, where's your mind?
Where's my mind? Well, I thought it was in my skull, but who knows? Well, for one thing, I should note that we have some books on our website that people can books and also URLs that people who are interested in this topic can look at to find out more. What I learned, well, that very intelligent philosophers think there's a gap, and that I'm not sure I know how to close it, but I'm not sure I don't know how to close it.
Do you think? Do you have a view? First, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you agree that there is a gap, and do you have a view about why there is a gap? I assume, like me, you're a materialist, right? So it's a puzzle to explain why there should be such a gap.
I'm a materialist, or as I would prefer, physicalist, in the sense that I think the same. In other words, where in the world do we find the mind? I think the answer is it's the brain, and the brain's a physical thing with physical properties. I think that there is an answer to the explanatory gap that has to do with the nature of explanation. I'm going to try to articulate in a blog at sufficient lengths to make it plausible, and I think I better leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to weigh in on this thing, too. I've been thinking about this consciousness thing for quite a while. I do, like you, find it puzzling, and I guess I do believe there is an explanatory gap, but nothing convinces me, because I'm hard to convince about these things, that it's an unbridgeable gap. I believe in the progress of science and that eventually science is going to help us understand consciousness itself.
I think one of our callers had a very good point, or maybe it was you. At any rate, one of the minds that weighed in, which is that explanation often consists not of just explaining why something is like it is, but contrasting the way something is with the way a lot of other alternatives are. And when we really understand how all the different sensations we have, when we understand what we were calling their neural correlates in the brain, we may have a sense that we can kind of explain why red things, why it's like it is to see red or taste Pinot Noir. You never know.
You'll never know. But you know what? Where you can find out is on our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog.
And you can download podcasts of our program from our website as well. For the final word on science and consciousness, we're going to turn to our 2-minute philosopher, Ian Scholes.
Ian Scholes, if mind is different than matter, what is it? Philosophers call this the mind-body problem. What makes it difficult to answer, paradoxically, is our own consciousness. How do we even know if we're asking the right question? We're limited by our senses, experiences. A blind person doesn't know what red is. We could be in that position, trying to play the piano, so to speak, when all we have is half an octave of black keys. So the mind is slippery, but the brain's another question. We can map that. That's where pain lives, and that little dingus there lets you know when it's time to eat. And on beyond neurology, technicians unconcerned about the true nature of consciousness nonetheless constantly find ways to expand it. Hearing aids, contact lenses, light bulbs, aspirin, antidepressants, telescopes, microscopes. There are those who think that consciousness-enhancing technology should be plugged into the human body and be done with it. A group of folks called transhumanists believe that we are about to exit biology and go to a fabulous new world where biochemistry, neurology, and cybernetics create fantastic post-human creatures for whom consciousness is all. And there are those who think we should raise our consciousness robotically for social-political reasons. Donna Haraway wrote an essay in 1991 called A Cyborg Manifesto, which claimed that if we became cyborgs, it might put an end to class and gender issues, creating an ultimate self untied at last from all dependency. She concluded, "I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess." Steve Mann, an engineering professor in Toronto, has a camera attached to his head and a computer to allow what he calls mediating reality. Udo Vector at the University of Osnabrück in Germany experimented with a vibrating belt that always let him know which way was north. He told Wired magazine, "I suddenly realized my perception had shifted. I had some kind of internal map of the city in my head. I could always find my way home. Eventually, I felt I couldn't get lost, even in a completely new place." If this post-biological world is coming, and our bodies become plastic vessels into which consciousness is downloaded, and our brains are eventually replaced by efficient, self-aware computers, if we say farewell to the flesh altogether and are able to see for 1,000 miles and spin out pi into infinity in seconds and live forever as long as they hang out of the parts warranty, I suspect we'll still be asking ourselves, if mind is different from matter, what is it? Yes, we might discard our bodies and discard our minds, but consciousness will remain, and we'll still be stuck with the mind-body problem. I gotta go.
Ian Scholes, the only man who can solve a philosophical problem in 60 seconds.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2007.
Our executive producer is David Demarest.
Special thanks go to Devin Strolovich, Neil Van Leeuwen, Zoe Corneli, and Mark Stone. Our senior consulting producer is Gordon Earl.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University.
Also from the Friends of Philosophy Talk and the members of KALW Local Public Radio San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed in this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
The conversation continues on our website, www.philosophytalk.org. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.